In 1974, the studio executives at 20th Century Fox ordered Fred Astaire onto the set of The Towering Inferno. But they didn't want him to dance. Instead, they forced the 75-year-old legend to strip off his iconic tuxedo, cover his face in soot, and play a pathetic, cowering old swindler. This wasn't a late career acting challenge. It was the deliberate humiliation of a cinematic god. When the golden age of musicals collapsed, Hollywood didn't let Astaire retire with dignity. They starved him out. They stripped him of his stage and reduced the ultimate perfectionist to a disposable background prop. To survive in an industry that now viewed him as a washed-up fossil, Astaire had to swallow his immense pride, abandon his dancing shoes, the very soul of his identity, and beg for minor, faded roles behind actors young enough to be his grandchildren. Before Hollywood turned him into a punchline, they bowed to him as a god. The brutality of his later years is only visible when measured against the absolute dictatorial supremacy he commanded in the 1930s. When Fred Astaire arrived at RKO Pictures in 1933, America was drowning in the misery of the Great Depression. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Bread lines stretched around city blocks, and a palpable sense of despair gripped the nation. The public did not go to the cinema to see their grim reality reflected back at them. They went to survive. They needed an escape, a pure, unadulterated fantasy of wealth, sophistication, and romance. Fred Astaire became the supreme architect of that fantasy. He was not a conventionally handsome leading man. Studio executives initially did not know what to do with him. He was balding, his ears were slightly too large, and he lacked the broad-shouldered masculinity of a Clark Gable or Cary Grant. The infamous apocryphal screen test evaluation, "Can't act, I can't sing, balding, can dance a little," captures the initial blindness of the industry. But Astaire did not need conventional beauty, because the moment he began to move, he ceased to be an ordinary man. He became a physical manifestation of rhythm. When paired with Ginger Rogers, the two of them created a cinematic alchemy that single-handedly kept RKO Pictures from plunging into bankruptcy. On screen, Astaire sold the illusion of absolute effortlessness. He wore an immaculate evening dress as casually as another man might wear pajamas. He tapped his cane, glided across polished Art Deco floors, and leapt over furniture without ever breaking a sweat or disturbing a single hair on his head. He made perfection look like a happy accident. But this was the greatest, most successful lie ever told in Hollywood. Behind the closed doors of the rehearsal studios, Fred Astaire was not a carefree romantic. He was a ruthless, obsessive, and often terrifying taskmaster. The elegance on screen was paid for with blood, sweat, and a punishing maniacal discipline. Astaire was driven by a deep-seated anxiety and a pathological fear of failure. He would rehearse a single routine for weeks on end, working 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. He would drill himself and his partners until their feet blistered and bled through their shoes. Ginger Rogers famously recalled that her shoes would frequently be filled with blood after a grueling session with Astaire, but she was terrified to complain because his standard for perfection was so absolute. He was never satisfied. He would review the day's rushes and agonize over a fraction of a misstep, a slight misplacement of a finger, or a microscopic delay in the rhythm. If a routine was 99% perfect, Astaire considered it a failure. This obsession extended far beyond his own body. In the 1930s, musical directors were fond of cutting away during dance numbers. They would show a close-up of the dancer's face, then cut to their feet, then cut to the audience applauding. Astaire despised this. He understood better than anyone else in the history of the medium that cutting destroyed the integrity of the dance. He issued an ironclad ultimatum to the studio directors. Either the camera will dance or I will. Astaire demanded that his routines be filmed in full-figure shots, from head to toe in long, continuous takes. He insisted that the camera follow him smoothly, acting as a silent partner in the choreography rather than a frantic observer. He stripped the directors of their power in the editing room. If he made a mistake 3 minutes into a 4-minute routine, he refused to let them cut around it. He would force the exhausted crew and his bleeding partners to start the entire routine over from the very beginning. He was a tyrant of rhythm, and the studio surrendered to him because the results were undeniably overwhelmingly lucrative. For a decade, Fred Astaire did not just work in Hollywood, he ruled it. He was an auteur who used his body as his camera, dictating the terms of his own cinematic existence. But this level of control was entirely dependent on a specific cultural ecosystem. The studio system of the Golden Age was a rigid, highly structured machine that understood how to package and sell glamorous escapism. They built magnificent white-on-white sound stages that looked like floating palaces. They hired the greatest composers of the 20th century, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, to write specific orchestrations for his feat. Astaire was the jewel in the crown, and the studio provided the velvet cushion on which he rested. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, however, the world outside the sound stages grew darker. The Second World War brought a new, brutal reality to the global consciousness. The pristine, untouched fantasy of the penthouse suite began to feel slightly out of step with a generation of young men returning from the blood-soaked beaches of Europe and the Pacific. The audience's appetite was subtly shifting. They still loved Astaire, but the intense immediate hunger for his brand of aristocratic escapism was starting to wane. Astaire, hypersensitive to the shifting winds of public opinion, felt this change. In 1946, after completing the film Blue Skies, he made a shocking announcement. At the age of 47, still at the absolute height of his physical abilities, Fred Astaire announced his retirement. He packed away his dancing shoes, opened a chain of dance studios, and claimed he was done with the cinema. It was a preemptive strike. His deep-seated insecurity and perfectionism told him it was better to walk away from the throne while he was still the king, rather than wait for the public to push him off. But retirement for a workaholic genius is a prison sentence. Astaire was restless, unfulfilled, and haunted by the routines he had not yet choreographed. When Gene Kelly, the new muscular athletic star of the MGM musical, broke his ankle prior to filming Easter Parade in 1948, Astaire was coaxed out of retirement to replace him. The film was a colossal hit, and Astaire was sucked back into the Hollywood machine. The 1950s provided Astaire with a brilliant, critically acclaimed Indian Summer. He starred in masterpieces like The Bandwagon and Funny Face. He danced on the ceiling. He danced with a hat rack. He proved that his creative genius was entirely undiminished by age. But while the films were brilliant, the environment was changing. The golden age of the studio system was collapsing under the weight of anti-monopoly laws and the terrifying new threat of television. The massive blank check budgets required to build the fantasy worlds Astaire needed were being slashed. More importantly, the cultural definition of masculinity was transforming. The men on screen were changing from sophisticated gentlemen into brooding, method-acting rebels. Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Montgomery Clift were mumbling, sweating, and tearing at their clothes. They were raw, angry, and distinctly unpolished. Against this new backdrop of gritty psychological realism, A man in a tailored tuxedo singing about the breeze seemed increasingly like an artifact from a bygone civilization. Fred Astaire was a man who required absolute precision in a world that was rapidly falling in love with chaos. He continued to work out of a sheer compulsive need to create, but the anxiety that had always driven him began to curdle into something darker. He was no longer fighting just for perfection. He was fighting against irrelevance. He was a master clockmaker in a society that had suddenly decided to measure time by the sun. As the 1950s drew to a close, Astaire faced a terrifying horizon. He was approaching his 60th birthday. His body, which he had treated like a high-performance machine for 4 decades, was beginning to feel the accumulated miles. The joints ached. The recovery time after a strenuous routine grew longer, but the physical decline was nothing compared to the cultural abandonment he was about to experience. The 1960s were approaching, bringing with them a cultural revolution that would not just ignore Fred Astaire, but would actively view everything he represented as the enemy. The era of elegance was taking its final breath, and the long, humiliating twilight of the greatest dancer in history was about to begin. When the 1960s crashed into America, it did not arrive with a gentle tap dance. It arrived like a shock wave that shattered the foundations of everything the Hollywood studio system had built. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, the escalating bloodshed of the Vietnam War, and the righteous fury of the civil rights movement fundamentally rewired the psychology of the cinema-going public. Innocence was dead. The audience, now comprised of a younger, angrier, and fiercely cynical generation, stared up at the silver screen and demanded to see their own fractured reality reflected back at them. They wanted mud, blood, and moral ambiguity. They wanted the grit of Midnight Cowboy and the anti-establishment violence of Bonnie and Clyde. In this new, abrasive cultural landscape, elegance was not merely out of fashion, it was actively despised. For Fred Astaire, this shift was not a career slump, it was an artistic apocalypse. He had spent 30 years selling a meticulously crafted illusion of sophisticated, champagne-soaked perfection. His entire brand was built on the premise that a man could solve any emotional crisis by slipping into a tailored tuxedo and gliding across a polished marble floor. But to a generation watching the nightly news, broadcast body bags returning from the jungle, a man in a top hat singing about the breeze was no longer a comforting fantasy. He was an insulting relic of an out-of-touch establishment. The audiences of the new Hollywood did not want escapism. They viewed the glossy, high-budget musical as a lie, a bourgeois distraction from a world that was burning. Astaire had done absolutely nothing wrong. His rhythm was still flawless. His legendary work ethic remained unbroken. But the brutal reality of the entertainment industry is that genius is entirely dependent on context. Without the ecosystem to support it, a master becomes a museum piece. The major studios, terrified of losing money in this volatile new market, ruthlessly severed the lifelines of the musical genre. The astronomical budgets required to build the sweeping Art Deco sound stages were slashed. The grand orchestras were disbanded. The very architecture of Astaire's kingdom was literally torn down. In a move of heartbreaking symbolism, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the studio that had once boasted more stars than there are in the heavens, began auctioning off its historic props and bulldozing its backlots to sell the real estate. The physical spaces where Astaire had defied gravity were reduced to rubble and sold for scrap. With the cinematic musical dead on arrival, the scripts sent to Astaire's representatives dried up. For the first time in his life, The undisputed king of the box office found himself staring at an empty calendar. A lesser artist might have simply retired, retreating to a Beverly Hills mansion to count his millions. But Astaire was afflicted with the blessing and the curse of the true workaholic, an obsessive, compulsive need to perform. He could not stop moving. If the cinema no longer wanted him, he would have to find a new stage, and so the ultimate cinematic auteur was forced to lower himself into the chaotic, disposable, and deeply undignified world of 1970s network television. At first, television seemed like a viable lifeboat. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Astaire had starred in a series of television specials, most notably An Evening with Fred Astaire, which swept the Emmy Awards and proved he could still command an audience. But as the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the medium of television mutated into something garish and cheap. The era of the sophisticated variety special was replaced by brightly colored, frantically paced weekly variety shows. This is where the true, quiet humiliation of Fred Astaire began. To maintain his relevance and keep his name in the public consciousness, the master of elegance was forced to walk onto television sets that looked like psychedelic nightmares. The pristine, sweeping long takes he had fought so bitterly to establish in the 1930s were impossible on network television. TV was shot quickly with multiple cameras, aggressive editing, and restrictive budgets. The meticulous perfectionist who used to demand 6 weeks of grueling rehearsal for a single 3-minute routine was now told to learn a dance in a matter of hours and perform it on a cramped stage covered in cheap linoleum. The visual contrast was devastating. Audiences sitting in their living rooms watched as the man who had once partnered with Ginger Rogers in breathless, soaring ballroom routines was now forced to share the screen with the disposable pop culture icons of the decade. He was booked as a special guest star on shows alongside the likes of young lip-syncing pop bands and heavily sprayed television personalities. The producers of these shows, desperate to bridge the generation gap, forced Astaire into a grotesque game of cultural camouflage. They wanted to show the kids that the old man was still hip. He was stripped of his Savile Row tailoring. The white tie and tails were replaced by the dreadful fashions of the era: wide-collared polyester shirts, ascots, and flared trousers. He was instructed to dance to upbeat, synthesized pop music, attempting to blend his classical tap routines with the jerky, casual dance crazes of the 1970s. To the untrained eye, he was still smiling. He still hit his marks. But to anyone who understood the depth of his artistry, it was a tragedy broadcast in full color. It was the sight of an aristocrat being forced to perform parlor tricks for a crowd that did not speak his language. The young director shouting action from the television booths did not revere him. They viewed him as a legacy act, a nostalgic novelty to bump up the ratings for the over 50s demographic. They did not understand the science of his movement. They cut away from his feet to show reaction shots of the audience. They framed him poorly. They suffocated his art. Astaire swallowed the indignity with the ironclad, stiff upper lip professionalism that defined his generation. He never complained publicly. He never threw tantrums on set. He treated the television producers with the same polite, icy courtesy he had shown the moguls of RKO. But internally, the psychological toll of this compromise was immense. A man who had spent his entire life in absolute dictatorial control of his own image was now entirely at the mercy of a machine that valued speed and cheap spectacle over genuine quality. He was suffering from a profound sense of artistic displacement. He He was a phantom, haunting a medium that did not respect his rules. Furthermore, the industry's perception of him was shifting in a way that wounded his intense pride. In Hollywood, once you slide from the singular leading man to the special guest star, the scent of blood is in the water. You are no longer the engine of the production. You are the hood ornament. His name, which used to stand alone above the title, was now crammed into a crowded list of television personalities. He was becoming a caricature of himself, trotted out to do the Fred Astaire thing for 3 minutes before the show cut to a commercial break for washing powder. To fight this creeping obsolescence, Astaire attempted a radical pivot. If the world did not want him to dance, he would prove that he could survive purely as an actor. He actively sought out straight dramatic roles, desperate to show the industry that he was not just a pair of tapping feet. He took on challenging, serious parts, such as his role as a cynical, doomed scientist in the post-apocalyptic nuclear drama On the Beach, 1959. He was excellent in it. Stripped of the glamour, he revealed a world-weary, hollowed-out sadness that surprised the critics. But Hollywood is a town built on typecasting, and the studio executives possessed a brutal lack of imagination. They did not want Fred Astaire, the dramatic actor. They found the image of him playing a suicidal scientist jarring and uncomfortable. They preferred the illusion. Even when he proved he had the dramatic chops to stand alongside the heavyweights of the era, the industry stubbornly refused to rewrite his narrative. He was trapped in a paradox. If he danced, he was dismissed as an old man doing a nostalgic, out-of-touch novelty act on television. If he acted in serious dramas, the studios and the public rejected him because he wasn't dancing. The trap had closed around him. He was a prisoner of his own legendary success. As the 1970s deepened, the desperation of the major studios to compete with television led to a new cynical cinematic trend, the disaster movie. And it was within this genre that Hollywood would subject Fred Astaire to the ultimate crowning humiliation of his career. They were preparing to take the man who had danced on the ceiling, strip him of his remaining dignity, and throw him into the fire. The tragedy of aging in the public eye is that the world never allows you to mourn the loss of your own youth privately. Fred Astaire's physical and cultural decline was broadcast into millions of homes, sandwiched between sitcoms and news reports. He survived the death of the Hollywood musical by sheer force of will, wrapping himself in polyester and pretending to belong in a world that had forgotten the definition of grace. He swallowed his pride to keep his name alive, but the cost was an internal silent suffocation. He had managed to avoid the scrapyard, but he had done so by allowing the industry to turn him into a mascot. Yet the television variety shows were only the prelude. The true brutality of the Hollywood machine was waiting for him on the silver screen, preparing a script that would force the ultimate perfectionist to publicly surrender the very tools of his trade. By 1974, the major Hollywood studios had discovered a highly lucrative, profoundly cynical formula for dragging a disillusioned public back into the cinemas. If the audience no longer believed in romance, and if they no longer wanted to watch the wealthy sing and dance in penthouse suites, then the industry would give them exactly what they craved: destruction. Enter the era of the disaster epic. Producers like Irwin Allen, dubbed the master of disaster, realized that there was millions of dollars to be made by gathering a bloated cast of A-list megastars and fading legends, locking them inside a confined space. a sinking ocean liner, a crumbling city, a burning skyscraper, and methodically torturing them for 3 hours. It was a genre built entirely on sadistic spectacle, and it was into this blazing, chaotic machinery that Hollywood would throw Fred Astaire, subjecting the greatest master of physical elegance to the most public and degrading role of his entire life. This brings us to the Towering Inferno, a production that wasn't just a blockbuster, but a public execution of Astaire's refined persona. To ensure the film's success, the producers needed a cast that represented a strict, ruthless hierarchy of Hollywood relevance. At the absolute top of the pyramid, earning the massive paychecks and the heroic action sequences, were Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, the rugged, sweaty, hyper-masculine gods of 1970s cinema. But to make the audience actually feel the stakes of the fire, the producers needed emotional bait. They needed vulnerable, elderly icons whom the audience already loved, so that their peril would evoke maximum sympathy. They cast Fred Astaire. He was 75 years old. The role he was handed was not a dignified elder statesman, nor was it a nostalgic nod to his former glory. Astaire was cast as Harley Claiborne, an aging, pathetic con man. Harley was a petty swindler who dealt in forged bonds, a man who attended the gala specifically to seduce and cheat a lonely, wealthy widow, played by another fading icon, Jennifer Jones. To fully grasp the vicious, stinging irony of this casting, you must look at the costume. In the Towering Inferno, Astaire is wearing a tuxedo. For 30 years, the tuxedo had been Fred Astaire's suit of armor. When he wore tails in top hat or swing time, it was a symbol of unimpeachable honor, effortless charm, and aristocratic grace. He was the knight in shining armor for the modern age. But in the Towering Inferno, the tuxedo is a mockery. It is the uniform of a fraud. The film deliberately took the visual iconography of the greatest dancer in history and inverted it, using his trademark elegance to signal deceit and weakness. The studio was effectively winking at the audience, parodying the very image that had saved them from bankruptcy during the Great Depression. Astaire, maintaining the stoic, ironclad professionalism that had defined his entire existence, accepted the role. He needed to work. He refused to sit in a Beverly Hills mansion and fade into obscurity. But stepping onto the set of the Towering Inferno must have been a psychological nightmare for a man of his temperament. Fred Astaire was the ultimate control freak. He was an auteur who used to command the soundstage with absolute dictatorial authority. He would halt a production if a single prop was out of place, or if a camera moved a fraction of a second too late. His art was the science of absolute pristine perfection. Now he found himself trapped on a set defined by total uncontrollable anarchy. Disaster movies are notoriously chaotic to film. The sets were built to be destroyed. There were controlled explosions, rushing water, falling debris, and thick, choking smoke. Astaire was no longer the choreographer of his environment. He was a helpless prop within it. The directors did not want him to look graceful. They ordered him to look frail. They needed him to stumble, to cough, to sweat, and to look terrified. The camera, which had once worshipped his full-body movements, capturing every flawless leap and spin in long, unbroken takes, now pushed in tight on his face. It lingered cruelly on his wrinkles, on the soot staining his skin, and on the fear in his eyes. The visual contrast between Astaire and his younger co-stars was a brutal commentary on the changing of the guard. While McQueen and Newman were swinging from helicopters, wielding fire axes, and barking orders, Astaire was reduced to cowering in the background. The man, who had once leaped over furniture with the lightness of a feather, was now filmed struggling to walk down a crumbling, smoke-filled stairwell, needing the younger, stronger men to physically guide and protect him. He was stripped of his dancing shoes, the very instruments that gave his life meaning, and forced to run for his life. For a man whose entire artistic identity was built on never letting the audience see the effort, being directed to look weak, exhausted, and pathetic was a quiet, suffocating trauma. He was a king forced to play the helpless jester in a burning castle, yet Astaire did exactly what he was hired to do. He delivered a performance of quiet, desperate vulnerability. He swallowed his pride and allowed himself to be the emotional collateral damage of a special effects blockbuster. And the industry, in a move of staggering, patronizing hypocrisy, decided to reward him for it. When the Towering Inferno was released in 1974, it became a global phenomenon, shattering box office records. When the Academy Award nominations were announced, Fred Astaire received his very first and only competitive Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. To the casual observer, this might seem like a triumph, a glorious late career validation. But look closer at the context, and the nomination transforms it into an insult of breathtaking proportions. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had spent the 1930s, 40s, and 50s largely ignoring the musical genre, dismissing it as frivolous entertainment that did not warrant serious critical recognition. They had never nominated Fred Astaire for Swing Time. They had never nominated him for The Bandwagon. They had watched him revolutionize the vocabulary of human movement, engineer groundbreaking camera techniques, and deliver performances of unparalleled physical genius. And they had handed him a non-competitive honorary special award in 1950 just to get him out of the way. Now suddenly, when he was 75 years old, covered in soot and playing a pathetic, fraudulent old man in a bloated popcorn movie, the Academy decided he was finally worthy of a nomination. It was the establishment's way of saying, "We did not respect you when you were a god. We only validate you now that you are broken, vulnerable, and playing by our new rules." It was a pity prize. It was a sentimental pat on the head for a veteran who had survived the inferno of the studio system's collapse. The nomination was not a recognition of his genius. It was a recognition of his mortality. Hollywood loves nothing more than to watch a titan fall to their knees, and they were rewarding Astaire for finally showing them his weakness. Astaire, ever the gentleman, played the game. He attended the 47th Academy Awards in 1975. He put on a tuxedo, a real one this time, and sat in the audience flashing his trademark, enigmatic smile for the cameras. He did not win. He lost the Best Supporting Actor Oscar to a young, intense, method-trained actor named Robert De Niro, who won for his brooding, violent portrayal of Vito Corleone in The Godfather Part 2. You could not script a more devastating, symbolic passing of the torch. Fred Astaire, the ultimate icon of elegance, discipline, and aristocratic grace, losing to Robert De Niro, the dark, gritty, hyper-realistic face of the new Hollywood. It was the final, undeniable confirmation that Astaire's era was not just over, it was buried. Following the Oscars, Astaire retreated further into his private world. He had proven that he could act in a blockbuster, but the experience had fundamentally exhausted him. The industry had shown him its true face. They did not want to create projects that utilized his unique twilight presence with dignity. They only wanted to mine his legacy for cheap emotional currency. He developed a fierce, almost hostile relationship with his own past. When journalists or documentary filmmakers approached him, begging him to discuss the Golden Age, to talk about his routines with Ginger Rogers or Rita Hayworth, he would shut them down with an icy, impenetrable wall of politeness. He refused to watch his old films. If one of his RKO classics came on the television, he would immediately change the channel or leave the room. To the outside world, this looked like modesty, but those who understood him knew it was a profound, unhealed wound. Every time he saw himself on screen, suspended in midair, defying gravity in a pristine white sound stage, it was a knife twist. It was a reminder of a body that could no longer perform those miracles, and a world that no longer cared. He hated nostalgia because nostalgia is the enemy of the working artist. Nostalgia meant you were finished. It meant your value lay entirely in the past tense. Astaire was a man who lived entirely in the present, but the present had become a hostile territory. He felt like a stranger in the very industry he had helped build. The young directors and producers didn't respect the ironclad discipline of his generation. They shot quickly, cheaply, and cynically. The reverence for the craft had been replaced by a frantic, profit-driven rush. He was isolated. The legendary composers who had written music for his feet, Gershwin, Porter, Berlin, were dead or retired. His legendary dance partners had either retreated from the public eye or passed away. He was the last man standing in a ghost town. But Astaire was not a man to simply surrender. If the industry wanted him to disappear, he would make them pay for every inch of ground he conceded. He would not give them the satisfaction of a spectacular, tragic Hollywood breakdown. He would not become a cautionary tale. Instead, he would embark on the final, most quiet, and most defiant phase of his life, a deliberate, methodical erasure of his own myth. He was going to ensure that when he finally left the stage, he would leave nothing behind for them to exploit. The soot and smoke of the Towering Inferno eventually washed away, but the stain it left on Astaire's pride was indelible. He had survived the disaster both on screen and off, but he had done so by allowing the Hollywood machine to weaponize his legacy against him. The Oscar nomination was a gilded cage, a reminder that the industry only applauded him when he stepped out of his genius and into their mediocrity. As the 1970s drew to a close, Fred Astaire looked out at a cinematic landscape that was entirely alien to him. He was tired of being the token veteran, tired of being the nostalgic hood ornament on films that did not respect his art. The physical deterioration of his body was an undeniable reality, but the deterioration of the industry's soul was what truly broke his heart. He was about to enter the final decade of his life, and he was determined to spend it on his own terms, setting the stage for a silent, bitter rebellion against the very concept of a Hollywood legacy. There is a highly specific, uniquely cruel psychological trauma reserved exclusively for the aging dancer. When a dramatic actor grows old, the industry simply shifts their archetype. The fiery young rebel morphs seamlessly into the wise patriarch, the grizzled veteran, or the fading king. Their instrument, their voice, and their face can adapt to the ravages of time. A dancer has no such luxury. For a dancer, the body is not merely a vessel, it is the entire vocabulary of their art. When the cartilage thins, when the joints stiffen with arthritis, and when the spine loses its miraculous elasticity, the dancer does not just age. They are muted. They are robbed of their primary method of communicating with the world. For Fred Astaire, entering his late 70s and early 80s was not a graceful descent into the twilight of his life. It was a daily physical betrayal. The man who had built an empire on the illusion of absolute weightless perfection was now trapped inside a biological cage that was slowly rusting shut. He possessed the exact same razor-sharp perfectionist mind he had in 1935, but it was now tethered to a body that could no longer execute the commands. This is the root of Astaire's profound hostile rejection of his own past. When journalists or eager fans asked him why he refused to watch his legendary RKO musicals, they assumed he was displaying a quaint aristocratic modesty. They were fundamentally wrong. Watching himself on television defying gravity with Ginger Rogers or Sid Charisse was not a nostalgic comfort. It was a form of psychological torture. Every flawless leap, every impossibly crisp tap combination was a searing reminder of the physical supremacy he had lost. It forced him to confront the agonizing chasm between the God he used to be and the fragile, aching mortal he had become. To look back was to invite the grief of a man attending his own funeral, so he simply refused to look. He instituted a strict ban on living in the past, slamming the door on the golden age because the drought coming from that era was too cold to bear. But avoiding the past did not protect him from the indignities of the present. Following his patronizing Oscar nomination for the Towering Inferno, Astaire found himself adrift in a Hollywood that had completely transformed into a corporate, blockbuster-driven machine. The new generation of filmmakers, the Spielbergs, the Lucases, the Scorseses, were revolutionizing the medium. They revered Astaire as a historical monument, but they had absolutely no idea how to utilize him as a working actor. When Astaire stepped onto a film or television set in the late 1970s, he was not treated as a collaborating artist. He was treated like a fragile, priceless piece of antique china. Directors were terrified to give him notes. Crews would fall into a hushed, reverent silence when he walked into the room. While this might sound like respect, to a working professional of Astaire's caliber, it was deeply isolating. It was the suffocating, cloying reverence reserved for the dead. He wanted to be directed. He wanted to work. But the industry only wanted to stare at him, projecting their own nostalgia onto his aging frame. This dynamic forced Astaire into a string of bizarre, deeply incongruous cameo appearances that highlighted just how far the king had fallen from his throne. The most jarring example of this era was his decision to guest star in a 1979 episode of the campy science fiction television series Battlestar Galactica. The visual absurdity of the casting is almost difficult to process. Fred Astaire, the defining symbol of earthbound 20th century elegance, was dressed in a cheap futuristic tunic, wandering around a soundstage designed to look like a spaceship, playing an intergalactic con man named Captain Dimitri. He took the role primarily because his grandchildren were fans of the show and because he possessed a stubborn, blue-collar work ethic that refused to let him sit idle. But watching the architect of the Hollywood musical trade dialogue with actors in robot suits was a stark, sobering reality check. It was undeniable proof that his kingdom was entirely gone. He was a sovereign without a nation, taking odd jobs in foreign lands just to prove he was still breathing. The deeper tragedy of these late-career cameos was the loss of dictatorial control. Astaire was a man who had famously commanded the camera to dance with him. He had fired directors who dared to cut away from his feet. Now he was a hired gun, completely at the mercy of hack television directors who did not understand the first thing about rhythm or framing. He had to stand on his tape marks, deliver his lines, and retreat to his trailer. The fierce, demanding auteur was reduced to an obedient employee. He swallowed his immense pride and performed these tasks with a quiet, grim professionalism, but the internal suffocation of his artistic ego was absolute. Beyond the sound stages, Astaire's isolation was compounded by the literal dying off of his entire creative generation. The people who spoke his highly specific artistic language were vanishing. George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, the musical geniuses who had tailored their orchestrations to the precise strike of his tap shoes, were either dead or long retired. Hermes Pan, his lifelong choreographic collaborator, and the only man who truly understood the mathematical precision of an Astaire routine, was no longer working by his side. Ginger Rogers, his most famous partner, was navigating her own difficult twilight. Hollywood had become a ghost town, and Astaire was its sole remaining sheriff. He felt entirely out of place at modern industry events, where the executives wore denim and the conversations revolved around box office demographics rather than artistic integrity. To survive this profound isolation, Astaire built a formidable protective shell around his private life. He became notoriously reclusive, tightly controlling who was allowed into his inner circle. And then, in 1980, at the age of 81, he made a personal decision that shocked the Hollywood establishment and proved once and for all that he was desperate to break free from the suffocating expectations of his own legacy. He married Robin Smith, a professional jockey who was 45 years his junior. The industry reaction was predictably vicious and deeply patronizing. The gossip columnists sneered. The Hollywood elite whispered that the old man had lost his mind, or that he was being exploited by a younger woman. They wanted Fred Astaire to remain the eternal, untouchable widower of his beloved first wife, Phyllis, who had died in 1954. They wanted him to sit quietly in his Beverly Hills mansion and behave like a respectable museum exhibit. But his marriage to Robin Smith was, in reality, a brilliant, rebellious act of self-preservation. Astaire did not marry a Hollywood insider. He did not marry an actress or a socialite who cared about his cinematic legacy. He married a woman whose life revolved around the dirt, the sweat, and the immediate visceral reality of a racetrack. Robin did not care about Top Hat or Swing Time. She cared about horses. For Astaire, this was the ultimate escape hatch. Robin anchored him firmly in the present tense. She provided an environment where he did not have to be Fred Astaire, the legend. He could simply be a man who enjoyed watching the races, playing pool, and escaping the relentless, suffocating pressure of an industry that only valued him for what he had done 40 years prior. The marriage was a deliberate rejection of Hollywood's necrophilic obsession with its own past. He found joy in a woman who looked forward, not backward. However, the industry had one final poetic role left for him before he could close the book on his career completely. In 1981, Astaire accepted a part in the horror film Ghost Story. It was an ensemble piece featuring a group of legendary, aging actors, including Melvin Douglas and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., playing a secretive group of elderly men who are literally terrorized by a vengeful specter from their past. The casting was a masterstroke of dark, unintentional irony. Here was Fred Astaire, a man who had spent the last 2 decades aggressively running from the ghost of his own golden era, playing a character being hunted by history. Astaire's performance in Ghost Story is chilling, fragile, and deeply moving. He looks frail, his voice is thin, and the trademark effortless glide has been replaced by the cautious, deliberate steps of an octogenarian. He did not attempt to hide his age or project an illusion of lingering youth. He stripped himself bare for the camera, allowing the audience to see the physical toll that 82 years of life had taken on the world's most famous body. It was his final appearance on the silver screen. He had survived the transition from silent films to talkies, from black and white to Technicolor, and from the studio system to the blockbuster era. He had endured the humiliation of the television variety shows and the patronizing pity of the disaster epics. With Ghost Story, he quietly closed the door on the medium he had helped invent. But as his physical health began to wane in the mid-1980s, Astaire's focus shifted to a new, much more vital battle. He knew that the moment his heart stopped beating, the Hollywood machine would immediately descend upon his corpse. The studios, the biographers, and the executives who had ignored his dignity in his later years would scramble to commodify his death. They would write the screenplays, cast the young actors to play him, and rewrite his life story to fit a tidy, inspirational narrative that completely erased the bitter, humiliating struggles of his twilight. Fred Astaire was a man who had spent his life demanding total control over his image. He was not about to let a studio executive dictate the final cut of his existence. As he lay in his final years, he began to legally weaponize his estate, setting traps that would infuriate the industry and ensure that the ultimate architect of illusion would take his greatest secrets directly to the grave. By the spring of 1987, the body that had redefined human movement was finally giving out. Fred Astaire was 88 years old, confined to a hospital bed in Los Angeles, battling a severe case of pneumonia. The lungs that had once sustained him through grueling 14-hour rehearsal days, allowing him to sing seamlessly while executing impossible tap combinations, were now failing. The ultimate physical artist was entirely immobilized, but as he lay in that sterile room, his mind remained as razor-sharp and fiercely protective as it had been when he ruled the sound stages of RKO. Astaire knew his time was up, and because he knew exactly how the Hollywood machine operated, he spent his final days ensuring that the industry could not exploit his death the way it had exploited his twilight years. Hollywood is an industry built on historical revisionism. When a legend dies, the studios immediately rush to sanitize the narrative. They commission glossy biopics, casting young, attractive actors to mimic the icon's mannerisms. They smooth out the bitter edges, edit out the humiliations, and package the star's life into a neat, triumphant 2-hour cinematic fable designed to sell tickets and win awards. Astaire was intimately aware of this necrophilic corporate reflex. He had watched the studios cannibalize his peers. He knew that the moment his heart stopped, producers would begin drafting scripts about his life. They would focus on the glamour of the 1930s, the magical partnership with Ginger Rogers, and the pristine white tailcoats. Crucially, he knew exactly what they would leave out. They would never film the reality of the 1970s. They would never show the humiliation of the television variety shows, where he was forced to dance alongside disposable pop stars in polyester shirts. They would never dramatize the suffocating indignity of standing in the background of the Towering Inferno, stripped of his dancing shoes and reduced to playing a pathetic soot-covered con man just to earn a paycheck. They would erase the decades of artistic displacement, the pain of cultural obsolescence, and the bitter reality of a genius forced to work beneath his own standards. They would lie to the public, presenting his life as an unbroken string of magical triumphs. Fred Astaire refused to be an accessory to that lie. In an act of supreme final defiance, Astaire weaponized his last will and testament. He inserted an ironclad legal clause absolutely forbidding any biographical film or television movie to ever be made about his life. He explicitly denied the studios the rights to portray him on screen. When asked about this draconian measure, Astaire was brutally blunt. He did not couch his decision in false modesty. He stated unequivocally, "However much they offer me, and offers come in all the time, I shall not sell. It is there in my will that no one is to portray me. I don't want my life misinterpreted, which it would be. I don't want to leave a legacy," he had said. "Just let me disappear." This was not the statement of a man who was ashamed of his art. It was the statement of a realist who despised the machine that owned his art. He knew that his legacy, if left in the hands of studio executives, would be twisted into a cheap commodity. By legally forbidding a biopic, Astaire executed the ultimate power move. He slammed the door in the face of the very industry that had patronized him for 20 years. If they had not respected him enough to give him dignified work while he was alive, he would absolutely not allow them to profit off his ghost when he was dead. On June 22nd, 1987, Fred Astaire died in the arms of his young wife, Robin Smith. The reaction of the world was swift, massive, and drenched in the exact kind of hypocritical nostalgia that Astaire had spent his later years aggressively running away from. The major television networks interrupted their broadcasts to announce the passing of a cinematic god. Newspapers around the globe printed glowing multi-page obituaries. President Ronald Reagan issued a statement mourning the loss of an American treasure. But look closely at the footage the news networks chose to roll that evening. They showed clips of Top Hat, Swing Time, and The Bandwagon. They showed a young, vibrant Astaire gliding across the floor with Ginger Rogers, seemingly untouched by the laws of gravity. Not a single network showed a clip of his humiliating cameo in Battlestar Galactica. Not a single obituary led with his Oscar-nominated performance as a cowering swindler in a disaster movie. The moment he died, the media and the entertainment industry collectively conspired to freeze him in 1935. They immediately erased the painful, undignified reality of his final decades, proving his deepest fears completely correct. They loved the illusion of Fred Astaire. They had no use for the reality of the man who had outlived that illusion. His widow Robin became the fierce, highly controversial gatekeeper of his estate. Adhering to the strict spirit of his will, she locked down his image with a ruthlessness that infuriated the Hollywood establishment. She sued producers, blocked tributes, and demanded astronomical fees for the use of his film clips, effectively building a legal fortress around his grave. The industry insiders, the same people who had pushed Astaire into the margins during his lifetime, now complained bitterly that Robin was ruining his legacy by hiding him from the public. They failed to understand that she was merely executing his final wish, protecting him from them. However, even the strongest legal fortresses have cracks, and capitalism is a relentlessly hungry beast. A decade after his death, the ultimate nightmare that Astaire had tried so desperately to prevent actually came to pass, illustrating perfectly the soulless, exploitative nature of the industry he despised. In 1997, the Dirt Devil Vacuum Cleaner Company managed to secure the rights, authorized by a controversial loophole, to use Astaire's image in a television commercial. Through the use of early crude digital manipulation, the company took footage of Astaire's iconic, joyful dance routine from the 1951 film Royal Wedding. The famous scene where he dances with a hat rack and digitally erased the hat rack. In its place, they inserted a dirt devil vacuum cleaner. Millions of television viewers watched in horror as the resurrected ghost of the greatest dancer in human history was forced to tap dance across the screen, cheerfully selling household appliances from beyond the grave. It was a profound, stomach-churning desecration of an artist's life work. Astaire's daughter, Ava, was publicly devastated, stating she was saddened that after his wonderful, exemplary career, he was sold to the devil. But the commercial was a massive success for the company. It proved with brutal clarity everything Fred Astaire had believed about the entertainment industry. The system possesses zero inherent reverence. To the corporate machine, a cinematic god is not a sacred figure. He is simply intellectual property. If they can figure out a way to make a dead genius sell vacuum cleaners, they will do it without a second thought. This post-mortem exploitation validates every bitter, cynical measure Astaire took in his final years. He knew that the system that had stripped him of his dignity in the 1970s would not hesitate to strip him of his artistic soul in the 1990s.